So let's first understand what we mean by air quality. Sometimes, even on all our TV channels now, we see an AQI flashed. Occasionally, you'll see a PM 2.5 or a PM 10. Help us understand these terms first. What is PM 2.5? What is PM 10? And what is AQI?
Yeah, maybe we'll start with some background for AQI. So there are 6 criteria pollutants. So what we mean by that are these pollutants that we would be concerned about and want to monitor and control nationwide. So those 6 criteria pollutants, and carbon monoxide, ozone, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, PM, particulate matter, and we'll get to that in a second, PM 2.5, PM 10, and in the US there is lead in PM 10. So you won't know how much lead there is in particles because of its neurological implications. So these criteria pollutants are known to have health effects. They are ubiquitous. So everywhere you go, you're going to see these pollutants at different levels. And while you could argue that there is no safe level, most studies show that you reach a threshold, which is where you start seeing observable health effects. So that's what these criteria pollutants are. But these are 6 pollutants, and their threshold levels are different. And even for practitioners in the field, it's difficult to keep up with where the thresholds are. So to keep things relatively, I would say, accessible to the general audience, policymakers have come up with AQI, an air quality index, that integrates these six pollutants. And there's a threshold value for AQI that we can relate to, 100. If it's below that, it means that none of the pollutants are above threshold. Okay. So even if one pollutant goes above threshold value, this AQI value will go up. So we calculate this index. We set 100 as the threshold value that the government has for a safe value. And so we say that if it's at that value or at 100, you're below that proportionally, you are safer, and above that, you're getting proportionally higher. And for each of the parameters, you can calculate and set 100 as this number that's equivalent to the threshold value for, let's say, carbon monoxide. And then you take the maximum of those 6 values and report it as a single AQI. So if carbon monoxide is high, or ozone is high, or PM 2.5 is high, it doesn't matter, then the AQI is going to be high. And so when you see an AQI value, and if it's below 100, that means all of the pollutants are below threshold values. If it's above 100, at least one of the values has gone above threshold. Of these, while all of these pollutants have health effects, the one that I might argue and is generally recognized as having probably the greatest health effect would be the particulate matter matrix, whether it's PM 2.5 or PM 10. And I'll argue in a few minutes that PM 2.5 being the more important of the two. But particulate matter, as we are sitting in this room, we can't, the air looks very clean in the sense that, there isn't a haze between you and me. I don't feel anything, we don't smell anything, but there's a lot of particles in the air floating here. And so if you weigh, and these are particles of different sizes. And if we could size these particles right now, you would find that they exist in all sorts of sizes, from a few nanometers all the way to maybe 10, 20 microns, maybe 20, 30 microns, right? And just for the audience sake, so the width of your hair.
Almost a factor of 100 to 1,000 more. I mean,
yeah, exactly. I'm saying a few nanometers to, so let's say 2 nanometers to 20, that's 5 orders of magnitude right there, right? 4 orders of magnitude. that's
And in comparison, a human hair is?
is about 70 micron, right? So these are the biggest particles, or maybe let's say about, just for keeping in the order of magnitude, about 1/10 of that, let's say 7 micron, but they're bigger particles than that in the air right here. So everything here is about 10 times smaller than the hair or much smaller, right? That's why they're largely invisible. And if we weighed all these particles, found out what the weight of these particles are, smaller than 2.5 micron in a meter cubed, let's say, or a centimeter cubed, different units. So in that meter cubed, if we found out what the weight of these particles are, of particles smaller than 2.5 micron, that would be PM 2.5. Anything, if you weighed all the particles smaller than 10 micron, that would be PM 10.
So PM 10 will always be a bigger number than PM 2.5.
Exactly.
It should
so
be
the
much.
PM 10 includes PM 2.5 and the mass of particles between 2.5 to 10.
Right. And because mass goes as diameter cube, PM 10 would be much bigger than PM 2.5?
Maybe. It depends on how many particles there are. You're right. If there's a substantial number of particles in the 2.5 to 10 micron, you should see the PM 10 could be much larger than 2.5, even with few particles in there. Oftentimes, indoor, there may not be a lot of those particles, so they could be similar.
So if I'm on a hazy day outside, what we see is mostly PM 10 and larger, or is a haze also possible due to very, very small particles?
That's a great question. So when we step out, and maybe the most visual of the air quality problems is haze. So the haze comes about because particles, when they interact with light, they're just going to scatter light. And so instead of, so if we are, if there's a building out there, light would reflect off of the buildings and come to our eyes. But with particles in between, that light is scattered out and the whole thing is hazy. And particles will scatter light all the way down to the wavelength of light, and maybe about half the wavelength of light. And wavelength of light, when you get to the blue wavelengths, about 400 nanometers-ish. So particles down to about 200 nanometers and above will be scattering light, will be creating haze. So it's not just the particles that contribute to PM10, but also the particles that contribute to PM 2.5 that's going to scatter light. And clearly, the bigger particles will scatter more light. And there's an approximate relationship of diameter squared. So bigger particles will scatter a lot more light, but there's a lot of small particles. So, this contribution is across the spectrum.
Why these two numbers, 2.5 and 10? I mean, what is the scientific basis for those two numbers?
No, it's that's again an interesting question there, right? And it's partly chemistry, partly biology. So particles of all sorts of sizes exist, and it turns out that we've got some really good inbuilt mechanism to remove many of these particles. And to start with, the structure of our nose facing down allows us to eliminate any big particles from coming in. And when these particles do come in, we've got the biology of our nose with our hair in there and so on that acts to filter these particles. So we can filter out a lot of particles through the nose and maybe the upper part of our respiratory system down to out here, the entrance of our the main respiratory system. We can filter out most particles greater than 10 micron. So anything greater than 10 micron, we are capturing out here, and we can dispose it off through a variety of mechanisms straight out of our body, right? Whether you cough it out or sneeze it out and so on. It is smaller than 10 micron particles that can make it to your lungs. And the 10 to 2.5 micron particles, and the smaller the particles, let's put it this way, the smaller the particles, deeper it goes into your lungs. And while we inhale, When we exhale out, some of these particles do come out. But smaller the particles, they go deeper in and they get trapped in there and they aren't coming out. And so, in general, smaller particles go deeper, can get collected deeper in the lungs, and then the only mechanism to remove it is through your, the bloodstream and so on. And they could eventually come out. But you're exposing your entire body to what you're breathing. And then you're impacting your lungs all the way down into your alveolar region, which is where a lot of our exchange of oxygen, gas exchange takes place, right? And the question is, so that explains why PM10, because we've got this filtering mechanism. 10 micron and below is what gets into the deeper respiratory system, long-term health effects. Why 2.5? So there have been a number of field studies done in early, maybe between 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s that have shown that in general, if you were to go make measurements out in typical urban environments, what you will find are multiple modes in the size distribution. Which means the number of particles in different sizes will vary, obviously. And they vary such that you get a lot of particles in certain small sizes. And then in the intermediate sizes, you get a lot of particles. And then you get a different mode of particles in the bigger sizes. And one of the valleys is around 2.5 micron. And what distinguishes particles smaller than 2.5 micron with the ones that are bigger is that many of the particles generated from 2.5 micron are chemically generated, meaning mostly by combustion.
The particles below 2.5.
Below 2.5, smaller particles are generated by combustion, and the bigger ones typically mechanically. Could be, by cars grinding up dust and so on. And so the compositions tend to be different. So in general, PM 2.5 coming from combustion activities, whether it's industries or from your tailpipe emissions, can tend to have a different composition than the mechanically generated, more dust-like particles that will be above 2.5. Different compositions mean different health effects. And the smaller sub 2.5 micron particles chemically generated could be more carcinogenic, for example, some of them. And so the health impacts are very different. So we are trying to track both of them. They both have health effects, different health impacts, different sources, and so we'd want to keep track of them.